Snow clung to the chapel's window panes like forgotten lace, thick and stubborn. Inside, lanterns flickered against the cold, their flames struggling to stay lit. The preacher stood stiffly at the altar, hands clasped in front of him, eyes flicking between the door and the bride. Silence crept in like frost. Maybelle Carter sat motionless in her custom-carved walnut wheelchair, her wedding dress billowing out like a snowdrift around her. Her hands, hidden in delicate gloves, trembled in her lap. The ivory satin had been a luxury, saved up from years of stitching quilts and hemming pants for ranchers. Now it felt like a cruel costume. They whispered. She heard every word. Too big for the chair. Ain't she? Poor man didn't know what he was getting into. Should have picked a sturdier bride. Her cheeks burned hotter than the stove tucked in the back corner of the chapel. The guests, sparse as they were, didn't even try to hide their stares. A few of them had come out of boredom, others to see if the mail-order bride would really show up in her condition. She had. He hadn't. The groom's boots had hit the floorboards 20 minutes ago, fast and loud. She'd clutched the bouquet tighter, convinced he'd just gone to shake off nerves. But when the laughter came, sharp and cutting from outside the chapel, something in her chest caved in. "You boys were right," he'd hollered. "A fat cripple? I'd rather marry my horse." The chapel door had slammed shut behind him, a gust of wind snatching the veil off her head and sweeping it into the aisle. It lay there like a ghost no one wanted to bury. Maybelle blinked once. Slowly, the preacher's face turned pale. He reached for her, but she rolled backward, wooden wheels creaking like a coffin cart. Her fingers tightened on the armrests. No tears. Not here. Not in front of them. She wheeled herself down the aisle, as if it were a battlefield. The dress dragged through muddy snow, tracked in from boots. A child near the back pointed and laughed. Her stomach twisted. She kept moving. Outside, the sky was a dull steel gray, thick with the promise of more snow. Her breath came in short puffs, sharp with cold and humiliation. The church door groaned, closed behind her. She sat there on the chapel steps, lace-soaked, curls unraveling, skin raw. How stupid she'd been to believe in love letters. She'd thought him sincere. His letters were sweet, full of flattery and dreams of a warm home and gentle hands. He'd said he liked a woman with meat on her bones. Said he wanted a real wife, not a picture doll. He hadn't mentioned her legs, but she'd told him. She'd sent the truth in ink. He just hadn't cared. Not until he saw her in person. The wind picked up, biting through the fabric. She tried to lift her hands to fix the shawl slipping from her shoulders, but they wouldn't move right. Her arms ached. Her heart hurt worse. "I'd marry you," came a voice from behind. She turned, startled. A man stood just beneath the awning, half-shadowed, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn duster coat lined with fur. A revolver hung low on his hip, a hat pulled low enough to hide his eyes, but not the scar that cut through the corner of his jaw like a lightning strike. He didn't smile. She squinted at him. Didn't ask. "No, but you look like you needed to hear it." The corner of her mouth twitched, close to a smile, close to a sob. She didn't give him either. "Folks around here ain't got manners," he added. "But you already knew that." "I know more than they think," she said, voice hoarse. "Know what it's like to be looked at and dismissed in the same breath." He pulled a tin from his pocket, lit a match, and offered her a warmed biscuit. "You look like you could use something to chew on that ain't someone's cruelty." She stared at it, unsure, but hunger tugged at her pride. She took it. His fingers brushed hers, brief, steady, warm. He didn't speak again, just sat beside her, close enough to share his coat's heat, far enough to let her breathe. "I'm not weak," she muttered. "I get around fine. I work. I can shoot a rifle better than most men. I believe you." She glanced sideways. "Why?" "Because you showed up." Maybelle blinked hard. Snowflakes danced around them, like ash from some quiet fire. He didn't look away. He wasn't gawking at her chair, or her hips, or her flushed, blotchy face. He was looking at her, steady, measured, like she mattered. "What's your name?" she asked. "Silas Boone. Sounds like a gunslinger." He gave a quiet chuckle. "I've been called worse." She tilted her head. "Why were you at the wedding?" "I knew the groom. Did some work with him once. Heard he was marrying a woman with real grit. Wanted to see if it was true." "And," she challenged, mouth tight. He looked at her, long and slow. Truth don't come dressed in lace. It comes in how you hold your head when they laugh at you. Her chest tightened. That familiar ache, the one that said maybe she wasn't entirely alone. Why didn't you stop him? Silas hesitated. Some men don't deserve interference. They deserve the weight of their own choices. He'll carry this one. She stared out into the falling snow. Her fingers found the edge of her dress, pulling the soaked satin away from the wheels. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Same thing you were always going to do, he said. Survive. A long silence passed. Somewhere in town, a horse whinnied. A door slammed. A piano started playing in the saloon down the hill. She broke the quiet. My name's Maybelle Carter. I came here thinking I was going to be someone's wife. Silas turned toward her. You still can be. A bitter laugh slipped out before she could stop it. You offering? He met her eyes, and for a moment, she saw no pity there. Just something deeper, something unfinished. Not today, he said, but I ain't going far. He tipped his hat, stood, and walked off through the snow, his coat flaring behind him like the wings of some worn angel. She watched until he disappeared into the whiteness. Maybelle sat alone for a long time, biscuit crumbs in her lap, the wind easing off just enough to feel like mercy. The ache in her chest dulled. Not gone, but quieter. Inside the chapel, someone blew out the last candle. The wedding was over, but something else had just begun. The wind howled across the high plains like a wounded animal, dragging snow across the earth in furious spirals. Maybelle Carter leaned into it as best she could, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, eyes barely slitted against the blinding white. The storm had come faster than expected, and now the town was behind her, swallowed by snow and silence. Her dress was ruined, soaked through, and clinging to her like frostbitten regret. The wheels of her chair groaned, fighting the packed drifts. Her breath came in short, choppy bursts. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay in that godforsaken town one more minute. Not after the chapel. Not after the laughter. Not after the look in those men's eyes. Each push forward sent a bolt of pain up her arms. Her gloves were soaked. Her fingers were starting to go numb. But she wouldn't stop. Couldn't. She'd survived worse. The wind knocked her sideways, nearly tipping the chair. She threw her weight to one side and cursed under her breath. Her hair was plastered to her face. Her lips had split from a cold. Still, she pressed on. She thought of home, if you could call it that. A tiny room above a butcher shop in Missouri, where she'd stitched shirts by candlelight and read every word he'd written her. Mr. Elias Granger, the man with the careful penmanship and sugar-coated lies. The man who'd promised her land, warmth, love. The man who'd called her a cripple to her face before walking out of the church in front of the whole town. A root snagged the wheel. She wrenched it free and kept going, though she could no longer feel her toes. The land stretched ahead in a featureless blur of white. Her breath came out in clouds, smaller and smaller. She whispered his name, not Elias's, but the other one, the stranger from the chapel. Silas Boone. He'd looked at her like she mattered. He hadn't flinched or pitted her. He'd offered a biscuit. Warmth. Words that stuck deeper than any insult ever had. But he'd left, walked off into the storm with a promise of not going far. She hadn't seen him since. Something cracked beneath her. Ice. Her wheels sank. She cursed and rocked back. The axle protested. Her breath caught. No, she muttered. No, you don't get to stop now. But her voice was swallowed by the wind. The chair wouldn't budge. She slid out of it, legs dragging uselessly behind her, and began to crawl. The snow bit into her palms. Her dress tore. The cold was inside her now, gnawing at her ribs. She reached a cluster of rocks and dragged herself behind them, curling tight. The world dimmed. Her eyelids grew heavy. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was how it ended. Not with a bullet or a blaze, but slow and freezing and quiet. She thought of her father's barn, the smell of hay, and the day the stallion bucked her straight into the side of the trough. She'd been 15. Her spine hadn't healed right. Her legs never worked the same again. Folks said it was a shame. Said she'd be a burden. Said no man would want her now. Maybe they were right. But just before the dark closed in, boots crunched nearby. A coat flapped. A voice cursed low and urgent. Maybelle. She forced her eyes open. Silas dropped beside her, snow in his beard, eyes burning through the storm. He scooped her up like she weighed nothing and wrapped her in the folds of his coat. She felt the heat of his body, the roughness of his hands, the panic beneath his calm. "I thought you weren't going far," she managed, teeth chattering. "You call this far?" He carried her through the storm, one step at a time. She clung to his chest, listening to the thud of his heart. It beat steady like hooves on packed dirt. He took her to a cabin, small, half buried in snow, with smoke barely curling from the chimney. Inside, it was dim and warmer than she expected. A fire sputtered in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. A cot sat against the far wall, rough wool blankets folded neatly. He set her down gently and began stripping off his coat, his gloves. She saw his arms were scarred, long, thin lashes of old battles. He moved with the careful grace of a man used to surviving. He handed her a cup. "Drink." It was broth, salty hot, healing. She drank greedily. "You followed me," she said after a moment. "Didn't have to. You left tracks a blind man could follow. I thought you didn't want to get involved." "I didn't." She raised an eyebrow. "Changed my mind." He began unrolling a bundle near the fire. Inside were clean bandages, a small bottle of whiskey, a tin of coffee beans. She watched him work, watched the way his hands moved with practiced ease. He didn't ask about the chair, didn't mention the dress. He just tended to her hands, rubbed warmth into her fingers, gave her space and silence. "I didn't expect to survive out there," she said quietly. "Wasn't about to let you freeze. You didn't owe me anything." "No," he said, "but I reckon the world already took too much from you." That stuck. She looked away. The fire popped. Her limbs burned as the feeling returned, painful, prickling needles under her skin. "Why help me?" she whispered. Silas sat across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I've seen what this land does to folks who don't fit into its mold. And because I've watched people turn away when they should have leaned in." He poured coffee into a tin cup. "My wife was the same. People called her odd, said she was too quiet, too clever. She saved my life more times than I can count." "She gone?" Maybelle asked softly. He nodded once. "Raiders hit our wagon 2 winters back. Took everything." She didn't scream, just loaded the rifle and told me to run. Maybelle swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. I should have stayed and died beside her. But I ran, lived, been trying to figure out what for ever since." They sat in silence. "I'm not her," Maybelle said after a moment. "No," he agreed. "You're different. You got fire." She laughed bitterly. "Not much use in my legs. You think a bullet knows the shape of your spine? You think a prairie fire asks if you can walk before it burns everything down?" She stared into the flames. "I thought getting married would fix something," she admitted. "That it would make me enough." "Getting married don't fix a damn thing," Silas said. "But surviving? That makes you more than enough." The storm began to ease outside. She could hear the wind shifting, turning. "You have a plan?" she asked. "For what?" "Living." He considered it. "Not really. Was in a drift through town, sell a few traps, maybe head east." "You're not from around here?" "Born in a jail cell near Abilene. Raised by a blacksmith with a drinking problem. Made my way west after the war." "Hell of a resume," she muttered. He grinned. "You could say the same." She looked at him for a long time, weighing her next words. "I can shoot. I can sew. I know how to keep food fresh through winter. I may not move fast, but I don't quit." His smile faded into something softer. "You offering a partnership?" "I'm offering not to be left behind again." He nodded. "Then you're welcome here. For as long as you want." She reached for the cup he held, their fingers brushing. "For now," she said, "I just want to feel like I'm not a mistake." "You ain't," he said. "You're the best damn surprise this land's ever given me." The fire crackled louder. Outside, a wolf howled. Not far. Silas stood, walking to the window. "We've got company," he muttered. "Wolves?" "No," he said, jaw tightening. "Men." He reached for his rifle. She pushed herself upright on the cot. "What kind of men?" "The kind I hoped I left behind." She didn't ask more. He moved to secure the door, his eyes narrowing. Maybelle wheeled over to the hearth, reached into the ashes, and pulled out a small iron skillet. Her hands no longer trembled. Her heart did, but it beat stronger now. "We gonna fight?" she asked. "If we have to." She nodded. "Then you better show me where you keep the bullets." Silas looked over his shoulder, eyebrows raised. "You sure?" She gave him a crooked smile. "You saved my life. Let me return the favor." He handed her the rifle. "I knew you would fire," he said. She cocked it with practiced hands, settling behind the window with a line of sight on the snowy path. "Then let's burn down anything that tries to take it from us." The first bullet shattered the window just as dawn lit the sky in bruised streaks of purple and gold. Glass sprayed inward, catching in Maybelle's hair and dress. She didn't flinch. Her hands were steady on the rifle, her eyes sharper than the cold air slicing through the broken pane. Silas dropped to a crouch beside her. 3 of them, maybe 4, coming from the ridge. "Friend of yours?" she asked dryly. "Not the kind I write home about." He peeked out and swore under his breath. "The one in the red duster. That's Cutter. Used to run with me back when I was dumb enough to think outlawing was living. And now they've come to collect? Something like that. Cutter don't forgive, don't forget." I left with a satchel of gold and a bullet in his shoulder. "Charming. Less so up close. He'll burn this place if he thinks it'll bring me out." Maybelle's lips tightened. Her fingers brushed the trigger, then steadied. "Then let's not give him the pleasure." She rolled herself to the far end of the cabin where the wall hadn't yet been breached and set up a second position. They had limited ammunition, an old Winchester, and a single crate of supplies. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next shot came through the door, splintering would near Silas's shoulder. He didn't flinch. He moved like a man who'd been shot before, fast, low, and sure. Maybelle tracked one of the shadows moving behind the trees and fired. Missed. Silas looked back, eyes wide. "You ever actually used that thing before?" "Not on people. Try not to aim for the sky." She exhaled, slow and long, lining up the next shot. This time, when the outlaw stepped from behind the pine, she fired. He dropped. Silas grinned. "That's more like it." She didn't smile. Her stomach churned, but she kept her eyes locked on the tree lean. No time for hesitation. No time for fear. The siege stretched on, the minutes drawn tight with tension. Cutter's men circled, testing the defenses, firing blindly. The roof took 2 hits. Smoke drifted in from a fire they'd set near the barn. They were trying to smoke them out. Silas knelt by the fireplace, stuffing blankets along the cracks in the floor. "They'll storm the front soon." "Let them," Maybelle said. "I've got a surprise waiting." She'd laid broken glass along the entry, rigged a pan of boiling grease just above the doorway with a balancing stick. Crude, yes, but effective. Silas paused to look at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "What? You always been this dangerous?" She shrugged. "Folks never gave me the chance to be." A shot tore through the sidewall, embedding in the cupboard beside her. She ducked. The fire hissed, throwing angry sparks. "They'll expect you to run," he said. "Good," she replied. "Let them keep expecting." Then came the voice. Loud, drawling. "Cutter, see Ila's boon. You gonna let that cripple fight your battles now? Heard you took a bride with a busted spine. That true? You hiding behind her skirt?" Maybelle's eyes narrowed. Silas moved to respond, but she put a hand on his arm. "No," she said. "Let me." She pushed the door open a crack and called out. "You think a woman in a chair's the easiest to break? That's because you've only ever fought men." Silence followed. Then laughter, cruel, loud, sharp. "I like her," Cutter called back. "Tell you what, Boone, send her out now, and I might just let you crawl away instead." She pulled the door shut, locked it, and rolled back. "I've heard better offers." Silas studied her for a long beat. "You're not scared." "I'm shaking inside," she admitted. "But fear's not going to move my legs, and it sure as hell won't stop a bullet. I've spent too long letting shame tell me who I am." The air grew hotter. Smoke began to sneak through the cracks. The fire outside was growing. They didn't have long. Silas picked up the last stick of dynamite from a box by the hearth. "We blow the shed. Draw them back. You can run faster than me. I'm not leaving you. Not asking you to." She rolled beside him, took his hand. "But if we don't do something now, they'll have our bones to pick by sundown." He hesitated, fingers curling over hers. Then he nodded. They worked quickly. Silas slipped out the back, hugging the shadows. Maybelle stayed by the front, rifle ready. The seconds dragged. Then, boom. The shed exploded in a geyser of fire and timber. Screams rang out. Confusion followed. Two of the men bolted, one catching a blast of flying wood to the neck. Maybelle waited, pulse hammering. The door burst open. Cutter. He stepped in like he owned the place, revolver raised, blood on his coat. She fired. The bullet hit his shoulder, opposite side this time. He roared, lunging forward. She tried to reload, but her fingers slipped. He was on her in a second, dragging her from the chair. "You little witch." Then Silas tackled him from behind. They crashed into the table, sending plates and bullets scattering. Cutter threw a punch. Silas caught it, headbutted him hard enough to knock a tooth loose. "Touch her again, and I'll tear your damn spine out," Silas growled. They struggled, but Maybelle was already moving, crawling toward the rifle. Her legs dragged like anchors. Her arms burned. Cutter reached for his gun. She grabbed the rifle, twisted, and fired from the ground. He collapsed beside the fire, bleeding out on the floorboards. Silas panted, crouched over her. "You okay?" She nodded, barely breathing. "You, never better." She pushed herself upright, wincing. "I've killed 2 men today. You saved both our lives." He helped her back into the chair. Outside, the wind had stilled. The other outlaws had fled. Silas leaned back against the wall, sweat and soot streaking his face. "They won't be back." "No," she said. "But if they are, we'll be ready." He looked at her, really looked, and something unspoken passed between them. "I knew you were fire," he said softly. She touched her chest, where her heart still beat like a war drum. "I didn't know how much I needed to burn." The cabin crackled around them, broken and smoky, but still standing. The snow outside had melted in patches, revealing hard ground. They were alive. Bruised, bloodied, but alive. And for the first time in her life, Maybelle Carter didn't feel like something to be pitted. She felt forged. Silas reached for her hand again. "We keep moving," he said. "We start again. Just us." Her smile was slow, but it came. "Then let's see how far this fire can spread." The snow had melted to slush in the days after the fire and the blood. The earth steamed at dawn. Breath rising from the ground like the land itself was sighing in relief. The cabin, battered and blackened but still standing, smelled of charred wood, iron, and pine smoke. Silence settled around it like a wool blanket, heavy, protective, earned. Maybelle sat by the open window, the light catching in the curls she hadn't bothered to tame. Her dress was patched at the hem, sleeves rolled up. In her lap rested a journal she hadn't written in for years. She didn't remember the last time words had come easily. But now they flowed like spring thaw, stubborn and sure. Each letter pressed into the page like a step taken after a long crawl. Silas was outside, splitting logs shirtless under the morning sun. The muscles in his back moved with the rhythm of a man who'd learned patience the hard way. His shoulder, still healing from the scuffle, was bound in linen. He never complained. She watched him for a long moment before returning to the page. They'd buried Cutter on the ridge where the wind never stopped blowing. Maybelle hadn't spoken a word over the grave. Silas had said one sentence. "May the cold keep him quiet." After that, they never mentioned the fight again. But something had changed, not just in the quiet between them, which now throbbed with the unspoken, but in her. She moved through the cabin with purpose. She'd built shelves from scrap wood, learned to pickle vegetables, even taught herself how to melt snow into clean drinking water when the stream froze solid one morning. Her arms were stronger. Her voice no longer wavered. And though her legs still refused her, she no longer saw that as a deficit. She was beginning to believe she wasn't broken, just different. And Silas, he saw her the same way. He came in, shirt slung over his shoulder, sweat tracing a path down his chest. His eyes went to her first always. Never to the chair, never to the scar on her temple or the misshapen twist in her ankle. Just her. "Got enough firewood to outlast a second war," he said, wiping his hands. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." She smiled, but there was tension there like a wire drawn tight. He noticed. "You're thinking about leaving," he said, not accusing, just stating fact. She nodded. "I thought about heading east. Maybe setting up a dress shop. I know how to sew. Could build a life." Sounds smart. It's what I thought I wanted. He waited, said nothing. She hated that about him sometimes. The way he let silences stretch, how he didn't fill them with noise or false comfort. He let her feel what she needed to feel. But then I look around, she said softly, and I think, what if this is the life? What if I stop trying to be someone else's idea of enough? Silas knelt in front of her. His hands cupped hers gently, like he might scare her off if he moved too fast. I never saw anything missing in you, Maybelle. Never once. You're whole. Stronger than most men I've known. But you don't need me to say it. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat. No, but I like hearing it. His thumb traced a line along her palm. Then I'll say it as often as you need. She set the journal down, eyes meeting his. When I came out here, I thought I was chasing love. What I found was something messy, harder, realer. What we've got, he said, it's not built on paper promises. No, it's built on fire and frostbite and bullets and burnt stew. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. She kissed him first. It wasn't soft. It wasn't perfect. But it was honest, and it made her heart beat like a war drum again. Later, they walked, or in her case rolled, along the trail that curled behind the cabin. The pines towered above, needles catching the sunlight in 1,000 tiny stars. He pushed her chair without asking, but always let her steer. There was a kind of dance between them now, one of respect and understanding. We could build something here, he said, kicking at a rock. I thought we already had. I mean something bigger, a place for people like us. She glanced up. Criminals and crippled brides. He smirked. Survivors. Fighters. Folks the world left for dead, but who kept going. Her brows lifted. A refuge. He nodded. People don't talk much about second chances in the West. They talk about killing or forgetting. I want a third option. Maybelle stared out over the land. It was harsh, untamed, unforgiving. But beneath the rough soil, something grew. Then let's build it, she said. But only if we call it Carter's Rest. He paused, surprised. I thought you'd want Boone's something or other. She smiled. You gave me your fire, Silas. Let me give a name. He took her hand again, held it tight. Carter's Rest, he said. I like that. The sky began to darken with an oncoming storm. Thunder whispered on the horizon, but neither of them moved. They stayed there, still and steady, as the wind picked up and dust scattered at their feet. In the distance, a rider crested the hill. Silas's eyes narrowed. He reached for the rifle on his back. But Maybelle didn't move. She just watched. The rider drew closer, then held up a white cloth, unmistakable. A signal. Peace. When the horse stopped 10 feet away, the rider, a young woman with a crooked scar on her chin, spoke first. You Boone. I am. I heard you and your woman burned down Cutter's crew. Word traveling. Folks are saying you got a place for those the law forgot. Silas looked to Maybelle. She nodded once. We do, but it ain't free. What's the price? Loyalty, work, and the understanding that out here, everyone carries scars. Some on the skin, some deeper. The woman dismounted. That I can do. And just like that, it began. In the weeks that followed, others came. Wanderers, widows, wounded soldiers, former outlaws, unwanted wives. They built slowly, carefully, every plank hammered into place by hands that once only knew loss. Maybelle taught the women how to mend saddles and shoot rifles. Silas ran drills and carved out a new code. No harm to the weak, no greed above need. The rules were simple, but they held. They built a fence around the land and planted wildflowers where blood had once spilled. The fields were rough, but they grew things. They laughed more. They sang at night by firelight. And Maybelle began to believe in something bigger than just surviving. She believed in home. One night, months after the snow first fell, she sat beneath the stars with Silas by her side. Her chair rested on a flat rock overlooking the valley. Below, lights twinkled from the cabins. Music rose faintly. Someone had built a fiddle for scrapwood. Do you ever miss the road? She asked. He shook his head. Not once. Even when we run out of coffee. He chuckled. Especially not then. She turned to him. I never thought a man would kneel beside me and see anything worth staying for. I didn't kneel because you needed saving, he said. I knelt because I finally found something sacred. Her heart swelled. Not with drama, not with fantasy, but with truth. They sat in silence, their hands intertwined. And when the wind rose again, it wasn't sharp or cold or cruel. It was warm, a promise whispered in the language only survivors understand. That would have been taken by fire had returned as life. Eliza Monroe stirred from a restless sleep, her cheek pressed against the rough bark of the tree. Icy tendrils of wind bit into her skin, and the rattle of metal against wood rang out as she shifted. Her wrists, raw and chafed, were shackled high above her head, iron cuffs digging into flesh swollen and bruised. A thin layer of snow covered her shoulders, her once warm woolen coat now stiff and frayed. She drew in a breath, shallow and hesitant, and felt the bitter air claw at her lungs. The forest around her was cloaked in silence, broken only by the distant creaking of branches burdened by ice. Her body screamed for warmth, for freedom, for anything other than this relentless cold that threatened to devour her whole. Eliza forced herself to move her fingers, grimacing at the lack of sensation. She knew enough to understand that once numbness set in, death would follow. She had counted the days at first, marking the passage of time by the fading daylight and the silver of the moon. But as the nights stretched longer and colder, her awareness slipped, and she lost track. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, more of a dull ache now than the sharp pain it had been. Dehydration left her lips cracked and bleeding, and every whisper of the wind seemed to mock her fragile existence. Her thoughts drifted to the night they came. Men with rough hands and hard voices, dragging her from the small cabin she had built with her husband. They had accused her of theft, of harboring secrets about stolen provisions. She had screamed for mercy, swearing her innocence, but their leader, a tall, grim-faced man named Halston, had not listened. They left her here, chained and abandoned, a cruel justice in their eyes for a crime she never committed. A tear slipped free, burning a path down her cheek, only to freeze halfway. Eliza tried to recall the warmth of her husband's embrace, his deep laughter as he played with their son. The memories felt brittle now, like old paper crumbling in her mind. A sob caught in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She could not afford to waste her energy on grief. She had fought against the chains at first, her wrists bleeding from the effort to slip free. When her screams for help went unanswered, fear gave way to anger, then despair. Now, she simply existed, holding on to some faint thread of hope that someone would find her. Perhaps a passing trapper or a lost soul wandering the woods. But as each day broke with no sign of rescue, that hope dimmed. The sky was a bruised gray, heavy with the threat of more snow. Eliza squinted against the pale light, her vision blurry from exhaustion. A small bird landed nearby, its tiny claws scraping against the icy ground. She watched it peck at the snow, envying its freedom. The world around her was stark and indifferent, a frozen tomb waiting to claim her. Her mind wandered to the warmth of the hearth back in the cabin, the scent of stew simmering over the fire. She could almost feel the softness of her son's tiny hands in hers, hear his giggle as they chased fireflies in the summer dusk. Eliza clenched her jaw, forcing the memories away. They would only break her further. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind howl through the trees, and whispered a prayer under her breath. If death was coming, she hoped it would be swift, not the slow, creeping chill that was already weaving through her bones. A sudden crack of a branch snapped her back to reality. Her heart pounded, eyes darting through the dense thicket. Silence returned, but now every sound seemed amplified, every shadow stretched longer. Eliza strained against the chains, ignoring the pain, her instincts screaming at her to flee. Footsteps, crunching softly through the snow, approached from the west. Panic coiled in her stomach, and she bit her lip hard enough to taste blood. A figure emerged from the trees, moving with a cautious grace. Tall and lean, draped in furs, his dark eyes scanning the surroundings. Eliza's breath hitched, tore between relief and fear. Was it Halston, come to finish what he started, or some other threat lurking in the wilderness? She held her breath, waiting. The man moved closer, his gaze landing on her. He halted, his brow furrowing. Eliza opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her throat was too parched, her voice stolen by the cold. The stranger approached slowly, as if wary of a trap. His face was marked by the harsh lines of survival, his hair pulled back, a single feather woven into the braid. He knelt before her, examining the chains, his gloved hands tracing the iron with a grim expression. She tried again, forcing her voice through cracked lips. "Help, please." The words were barely more than a rasp, but his eyes flicked to hers, assessing. He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade gleaming even in the dim light. Eliza flinched, but he did not move toward her, instead inspecting the lock on the chains. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and uncertain. Then, with a swift motion, he jammed the knife into the shackle's keyhole, working it with careful precision. A low grunt of frustration escaped him as the ice-encrusted metal resisted. He muttered something in a language Eliza didn't understand, but his tone was one of determination. The chains finally gave way with a metallic snap, and Eliza collapsed forward, caught by the stranger before she hit the ground. He eased her to a sitting position, propping her against the tree. She looked up at him, her vision swimming. He offered a flask, and she took it with trembling hands, the water tasting sharper than any memory. His expression softened, though his eyes remained guarded. She didn't know who he was or why he had chosen to help, but in that moment, gratitude overwhelmed her. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but the weight of days spent alone and terrified pulled her under. Darkness seeped in at the edges of her vision, and she let herself go. The last thing she felt was the warmth of his hand steadying her. When she awoke, the sky had darkened, and a small fire crackled nearby. The man was still there, tending to the flames. Eliza flexed her fingers, surprised by the return of feeling. The stranger glanced over, offering her a piece of dried meat. She hesitated, then took it, savoring the taste despite its toughness. "Thank you," she managed, voice rough. The man nodded, not offering words. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, more like the quiet of a winter night shared between those who had seen too much. Eliza's mind spun with questions. Who was he? Why had he helped? And would the men who left her return? But for now, just being free from the tree, the chains gone, was enough. The man looked at her with a calm that seemed rooted in the land itself. Eliza wanted to ask his name, but exhaustion pulled her back under. As sleep claimed her, she could still feel his presence, a silent sentinel against the cold, and for the first time in days, hope flickered in her. Eliza awoke to the soft crackle of firewood and the dull ache of returning warmth. Her limbs trembled as heat seeped into her bones, the thawing agony nearly as unbearable as the cold that had threatened to steal her life. She opened her eyes slowly, lids heavy and swollen, and saw the man crouched by the fire's edge, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. His presence was both a comfort and a puzzle. She could not understand why he had freed her, nor why he had chosen to stay. The thought of waking to find herself alone again had haunted her dreams, but he remained, a silent shadow, keeping the darkness at bay. Eliza struggled to sit up, muscles stiff and protesting. Her breath hissed through her teeth, but she forced herself upright, drawing the rough blanket he had laid over her close around her shoulders. The man's gaze flickered toward her, his dark eyes assessing. There was a hardness there, but also something gentler, something she could not name. "Thank you," she said, her voice still rasping, as though the chains had not only bound her wrists but her words as well. He nodded, the gesture slight, more acknowledgement than reply. His knife rested beside him, gleaming in the firelight, its blade sharp and well cared for. He was a man who understood survival, who thrived in these harsh, unforgiving lands. His face bore the marks of experience, weathered skin, sharp lines etched by cold and hardship. Eliza's curiosity stirred despite her exhaustion. "Why did you help me?" For a moment, she thought he might ignore the question, but his gaze met hers, and he spoke in slow, measured words. You were dying? His voice was deep, carrying a weight she could not quite decipher. It was not kindness alone that had driven him to intervene. Duty, perhaps, or something else altogether. She pressed her lips together, sensing the reluctance in his manner. He had no desire for conversation, yet he remained. "My name is Eliza," she offered, her tone cautious. "Eliza Monroe." He regarded her in silence before speaking. "Chaska." The name settled between them like fresh snow, its simplicity and strength reflecting the man himself. She nodded, the effort costing her more than she cared to admit. "Where are we?" "Far from where they left you," he said. "Safe for now." She tried to suppress the shiver that ran through her at the mention of her captors. Halston and his men had been cruel, their judgment swift and merciless. They had not cared for her innocence, only the satisfaction of casting blame for their own failings. "Those men," she started, her voice breaking. "They'll come back, won't they?" Chaska's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps, but they do not know these lands as I do." His confidence was not arrogance, it was fact. Eliza found herself believing him, though fear still coiled in her stomach. If Halston returned, his vengeance would be brutal. But Chaska had freed her from chains. He had kept her alive. She clung to that small mercy like a lifeline. Days passed in a rhythm of silence and brief exchanges. Chaska hunted and gathered, his movements swift and efficient. He brought her strips of dried meat, bitter roots, and once a small bundle of berries that tasted like hope. Each day her strength returned, though her wrists remained bandaged, the skin beneath scarred and tender. The language between them was sparse, more gestures than words. Chaska was not unkind, but neither was he gentle. He worked with precision, his focus always on survival. Eliza admired his skill, his uncanny ability to read the land's secrets. She began to study him, noticing the way his gaze swept their surroundings, how his fingers traced the ground's contours to read what she could not see. One night, as the fire sputtered against a rising wind, Eliza found the courage to speak. "Were you out there looking for me?" "No." His response was blunt, but not cruel. "I hunt the men who chained you." The revelation struck her like a blow. She straightened, eyes wide. "What?" "They came through my village, took what they wanted, left death behind." Chaska's words were flat, devoid of emotion, but the grief in his eyes was unmistakable. Eliza felt shame ripple through her. She had been so consumed by her own suffering that she had not considered what pain others might carry. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded, acknowledging her words but not accepting them. Forgiveness was not what he sought. Vengeance, perhaps. Justice, certainly. "What will you do when you find them?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "End them." There was no hesitation, no hint of doubt. His resolve was absolute, forged by loss and sharpened by time. Eliza felt her heart quicken, her own anger rekindling. Halston and his men had left her to die, believing her weak, unworthy of mercy. She could not forget the sound of their laughter as they walked away, the iron bite of the shackles sinking into her wrists. "Take me with you." The words tumbled from her mouth before she could reconsider. Chaska's brow furrowed, his expression darkening. "No, I can fight. I can help you find them. You can barely walk." His words stung, but they were true. Still, Eliza's desperation overpowered her reason. "I'll get stronger. You've kept me alive this long. Teach me." For a moment, Chaska simply stared at her. His eyes were cold, calculating, weighing her words like stones. Finally, he spoke. "Why?" "Because they took everything from me," she said, her voice trembling. "And I can't bear to live with that. Not without trying to take something back." Chaska's silence was long and heavy. Then, with a reluctant nod, he gestured for her to stand. Eliza pushed herself to her feet, her legs wobbling but holding. It was not strength that kept her upright, but fury, a burning, consuming need for retribution. The following days became a trial by fire. Chaska showed her how to move through the forest without leaving a trace, how to set snares and fish the icy streams. Her body ached from the effort, but pain became familiar, almost comforting. It meant she was alive, that she was fighting for something beyond mere survival. They spoke little, but their silence grew companionable. She learned to read his gestures, to anticipate his intentions before he voiced them. He tested her, pushed her limits, and when she stumbled, he watched her claw her way back up without offering aid. She grew stronger. Her movements became deliberate, her gaze sharper. The air no longer felt like an enemy, but a challenge she could meet. She followed Chaska's instructions with a fervor that bordered on madness, each lesson another rung on her climb toward vengeance. One evening, as they sat by the fire's glow, Chaska handed her a knife. Its weight was solid, the blade curved and sharp. Her fingers curled around the hilt, her grip steady. "Why now?" she asked, glancing up at him. "You are ready." The simplicity of his answer caught her off guard. Eliza nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. But beneath her determination, a deeper connection had begun to form. In his silence, she had found strength. In his guidance, a reason to keep moving. And when she finally drifted into sleep, the knife resting beside her, she dreamed not of chains and frostbitten death, but of fire and blood and the promise of something more. The knife felt natural in her hand now, the once alien weight transformed into something familiar and comforting. Eliza's grip was firm, her movements quick and deliberate as she sliced through branches to fashion a makeshift shelter. Chaska watched her from a distance, his gaze as unreadable as ever. But she had learned to interpret the subtle shifts in his expression, the nearly imperceptible nods of approval he granted when her progress pleased him. Days bled into weeks, and her body grew stronger, tempered by hunger, fatigue, and the relentless cold. Chaska's training was harsh, unforgiving as the land itself. He pushed her to the edge of endurance, testing her limits until her legs trembled and her fingers bled. And when she faltered, he simply waited, offering no comfort beyond the silent expectation that she would rise again. She did. Every time. Their communication remained sparse, though not for lack of effort on Eliza's part. Chaska's reticence was a barrier she could not breach, his words carefully measured, his demeanor distant. Yet his actions spoke volumes. When he caught a hare, he shared it without question. When the fire needed tending, he showed her the proper way to feed it, coaxing the flames to life even under a sky thick with snow. They worked in tandem, their shared purpose sharpening their bond. Eliza's determination had evolved from blind rage into something colder, more precise. Vengeance was no longer a vague hunger gnawing at her soul. It was a goal, a path she had chosen with clear-eyed certainty. Chaska taught her to read the land, to follow tracks through mud and snow, to listen for the faintest rustle of disturbed brush. Her senses sharpened, the dull haze of pain and grief replaced by the clarity of intent. He drilled her with the knife until her movements were fluid, instinctive. The cuts on her palms healed into calluses, the ache in her muscles a constant reminder of how far she had come. One morning, as the sky brightened with the faint blush of dawn, Chaska gestured for her to follow him. His manner was brisk, his eyes fierce. She matched his pace, her breath clouding in the chill air. They tracked for hours, moving through dense thickets and across frozen streams. Chaska's steps were soundless, his presence as elusive as smoke. Eliza mimicked his movements, careful not to disturb the brittle silence. At the crest of a hill, Chaska halted, his gaze fixed on something beyond the tangled expanse of trees. Eliza crouched beside him, her chest heaving from the exertion. "There," Chaska whispered, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. Eliza followed his line of sight and saw it. A small encampment nestled between the rocks, the remnants of a fire smoldering in the cold morning air. Men moved about, their voices muffled by distance, but recognizable by their coarse, barking tones. Halston's men. Her blood went cold, every nerve alight with a mingling of fear and fury. The months of training had prepared her for this moment, but nothing could still the wild hammering of her heart. Chaska's gaze remained fixed on the camp, his expression impassive. 6 men, he said. 2 on watch. The others sleep. His analysis was clinical, his words sharp and unyielding. Eliza clenched her jaw, her hands trembling as she fought to maintain composure. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice thin but steady. Chaska regarded her with the same unwavering intensity he had shown since the day he freed her. "We wait. Learn their patterns. Strike when they're weakest. Patience." It was a lesson he had drilled into her from the beginning. Yet the sight of those men, so close, taunted her with the promise of retribution. She wanted to storm the camp, to carve her anger into their flesh, to reclaim the power they had stolen from her. But she did not move. Instead, she followed Chaska's lead, watching from their vantage point as the men went about their routines. Their weapons were carelessly stacked by the fire, their conversations loud and careless. Their arrogance only deepened her resolve. Days passed in the cold shadow of the hillside. Chaska and Eliza observed, marking the habits of their prey with meticulous precision. She learned their names, their roles within the group. Halston was not among them, but the others were there, the ones who had laughed as they left her to die. When Chaska spoke of the attack, his voice was calm and measured. "Tonight, when the fire burns low, 2 will be on watch. The others will sleep." He glanced at her, his expression guarded. "Are you ready?" Eliza met his gaze, the icy certainty of her purpose reflected back at her. Yes. They crept through the darkness like wraiths, their footsteps muffled by the soft cushion of snow. The camp's fire had dwindled to a weak glow, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and unwashed bodies. Chaska moved ahead, his knife already drawn, eyes sharp and unyielding. Eliza followed, her own blade clutched tight in her hand. The months of training had honed her reflexes, but nothing could have prepared her for the visceral terror that coursed through her veins. Her breathing came fast and shallow, her heart a thunderous drumbeat against her ribs. They struck with the precision of hunters. Chaska took down the first guard with ruthless efficiency, his knife slicing through the man's throat before he could make sound. Eliza mirrored his actions, her own blade plunging into the chest of the second sentry. Blood spilled hot over her hands. The man's eyes wide with shock before the light left them altogether. There was no time for hesitation. Chaska gestured toward the tents, his expression as hard as stone. Eliza moved forward, her limbs trembling but her resolve unbroken. She tore through the canvas, her knife raised and ready. The men within scrambled for their weapons, their confusion giving her the advantage. She slashed and stabbed, her strikes wild but effective. Pain flared in her shoulder as a fist connected, but she retaliated with savage force, driving her blade into flesh until the man collapsed in a heap. The battle was brutal, chaotic. Chaska's presence was a constant anchor, his movements swift and deadly. They fought with a desperation born of purpose, their enemies falling one by one. When the last man lay motionless at her feet, Eliza dropped to her knees, her chest heaving, her hands slick with blood. The world swayed around her, a dizzying blur of violence and triumph. Chaska stood beside her, his gaze unreadable. "You fought well." She nodded, her throat tight. Was Halston here? No. The word cut through her like a blade. The one man she craved vengeance against had eluded them once more. Eliza's shoulders sagged, the exhaustion of the fight weighing her down. But beneath the disappointment, a fierce determination remained. Halston was still out there, his cruelty unchecked, and she would not rest until justice had been served. Chaska watched her, his expression softened by something she could not quite name. "This was only the beginning," he said. "You are stronger now, but the path ahead will be harder." "I'm not afraid," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. And as the dawn crept over the horizon, staining the snow with a pale golden light, she knew she spoke the truth. The trail grew colder with each passing day. Winter's grip tightened around the world, snow thickening across the plains and forests until even the air tasted sharp and metallic. Eliza and Chaska pushed onward, their determination a fragile but unyielding ember. Despite the bitter cold and gnawing hunger, they moved with purpose, each step drawing them closer to the man who had wronged them both. Their bond had solidified through blood and struggle, the unspoken understanding between them deepening. They spoke more now, Eliza's words spilling freely, as if breaking her silence might banish the shadows still clinging to her thoughts. Chaska listened with quiet patience, his responses brief but thoughtful. He shared pieces of his own history, fragments of a life torn apart by Halston's cruelty. His family had been scattered, his people threatened and weakened by raids carried out under the guise of settling disputes. Eliza found herself drawn to his resilience, his relentless will to protect what little remained. He had suffered, but his pain had been forged into something sharper, something that cut through his enemies with lethal precision. She admired him for that, even as her own wounds struggled to heal. Halston's name was a curse between them, uttered only when necessary. His brutality stretched far beyond the tree where she had been left to die. Villages plundered, families scattered, all beneath the banner of so-called justice. Chaska's rage was personal, a deep wound masked by his outward composure. But Eliza's anger was raw and desperate, a fire that burned brighter each time they found another trace of Halston's cruelty. It was during one of their silent marches that they came across a small trading post, its weathered walls sagging beneath the weight of accumulated snow. The proprietor, a nervous man with darting eyes, eyed them warily as they entered. Eliza's worn appearance and Chaska's stoic presence unsettled him, but the promise of coin loosened his tongue. Halston passed through here, the trader confessed, his voice a shaky whisper. Bought supplies, bragged about some bounty he's after, said he was headed north, to the old fort. The revelation struck Eliza like a fist. Halston was close, his trail fresh enough to follow. She exchanged a glance with Chaska, her pulse quickening. They left the trading post without further words, urgency propelling their steps. The journey north was grueling. The wind howled like a living beast, tearing at their clothing and biting through their skin. Days blurred into a constant struggle against the elements, but neither spoke of turning back. Eliza's strength had grown, her movements as assured and precise as Chaska's. She hunted alongside him, her hands steady as she skinned rabbits and snared fish. The wild had carved her anew, the fear and doubt that once plagued her now buried beneath layers of resilience. Yet, as they neared the fort, her anxiety flared, the specter of her former captors haunting her thoughts. Would she falter when the moment came? Would her courage prove brittle when faced with Halston's cruelty once more? She voiced her fears one night as they sat by a low-burning fire, her words slipping free before she could reconsider. What if I fail? Chaska's gaze met hers, his eyes reflecting the glow of the fire. Failure is not trying. The simplicity of his response startled her. He spoke as though success or failure were concepts crafted by men who feared consequence more than inaction. For Chaska, the only sin was doing nothing. Eliza let his words sink in, drawing strength from their simplicity. She had come too far to falter now. Halston was within reach, his blood price waiting to be collected. They found the fort at dusk, its crumbling walls bathed in the dim orange light of a dying sun. What had once been a military outpost was now a fortress of desperation, inhabited by bandits and deserters loyal only to Halston's ruthless command. Eliza and Chaska observed from the cover of trees, their breaths fogging the frigid air. Fires dotted the interior of the fort, figures moving like shadows across the battered courtyard. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, their vigilance born of fear rather than discipline. Too many to face head-on, Chaska muttered, his eyes narrowing. We draw them out, Eliza replied, her voice steady. Divide them. Take them down one by one. Chaska's nod was swift, approval gleaming in his gaze. They spent hours planning, whispering strategies beneath the cover of darkness. By the time the moon rose high above, their course was set. They struck at midnight. Eliza crept along the outskirts of the fort, her footsteps silent as snowflakes. She cut through ropes holding supply barrels aloft, sending them crashing to the ground with a thunderous clatter. The guards rushed toward the noise, weapons drawn, their shouts echoing into the night. Chaska was upon them before they could react, his knife flashing like a serpent's fawn. Eliza followed his lead, her blade moving with lethal precision. The battle was a blur of blood and screams. Men fell before them, their surprise swiftly turning to terror. Eliza's movements were swift, her strikes sure. She fought not with rage, but with purpose, each swing of her knife guided by the knowledge that this was her only chance at redemption. They tore through the fort's defenses with ruthless efficiency, scattering Halston's men like chaff before the wind. The survivors fled into the night, their courage spent. Eliza's breath came in ragged bursts as she stumbled through the wreckage, her eyes searching for the man who had haunted her every waking moment. Chaska moved beside her, his presence a silent assurance. They found Halston in the main hall, surrounded by the remnants of his stolen wealth. His face twisted into a sneer as they entered, his hand already reaching for the rifle resting against a chair. Eliza moved first, her blade flashing toward his chest. Halston dodged, his own knife slicing through the air with vicious intent. They circled each other, their movements fueled by hatred and desperation. Chaska held back, his stance guarded. This was Eliza's fight, her vengeance. Halston's words were taunts, laced with disdain. I should have left you for the wolves. You've got more fight than I thought, but it won't save you. Eliza's reply was a snarl, her anger sharp and cold. She lunged forward, her knife carving a shallow gash along his arm. Halston retaliated with a brutal strike, his fist slamming into her ribs. Pain exploded through her side, but she kept her footing, refusing to falter. Their struggle continued, brutal and unrelenting. But Halston's arrogance had dulled his edge. He underestimated her, believing her still the helpless woman he had left chained to a tree. With a final, desperate strike, Eliza drove her blade deep into his chest. Halston's eyes widened, his mouth gaping as blood bubbled from his lips. He crumpled to the ground, his body twitching before stillness claimed him. Eliza stood over him, her chest heaving, the knife trembling in her hand. It's done, Chaska said, his voice low and steady. She met his gaze, her eyes brimming with something she could not name. Relief, grief, vindication. They walked from the ruins of the fort as the sky began to brighten with the first glow of dawn. The fire of vengeance had burned itself out, leaving Eliza hollow but alive.
Chaska remained at her side, his presence a balm against the emptiness. Together, they walked toward an uncertain future, bound by pain, resilience, and something deeper.